Canon R6 Mark II or R7?
Which one of these cameras is the best for wildlife photography on a budget? Is all that reach just too good to pass up?
Let's find out.
Our buddies over at Camera Canada sent me this nice R6 Mark II to play around with. Also, they were nice enough to be the sponsor of this episode, so if you are in the market for some new camera gear, you definitely want to check them out. Now, as for the camera, I got it just a few weeks ago, and I've been playing around with it a little bit. Most recently, I was out and was trying to find some rufous hummingbirds. And when it comes to photographing hummingbirds, a lot of the time, what you want to do is to try to figure out a reliable perch that they keep going back to. I found this one actually really nice perch. A man who appreciates a nice perch would really like this perch. Nice little buds and little leaves coming off it, and that's just what he was choosing to land on. And he would chase the other ones away, and then he would keep coming back. So this was like the perfect opportunity, not only to get a good shot of the bird, but also to test out some of the features of this camera. Basically what I was trying to do was wait for him to come back. I had pre-focused, and I was just waiting to see where he was. And when I'd see him coming back to the perch, I would just hold down the shutter button. I could have done the pre-roll thing, but I actually didn't feel like I really needed that. I just thought, if I can see him coming, I'll just blast away. And this camera shoots at 40 frames a second, so it provided some really nice opportunities to get some cool shots.
Yes, the 40 frames per second were awesome. I felt like I could capture things I couldn't even see with my eyes, and that would have been awesome for the hummingbird as well. But what were some of the other things that you enjoyed about the camera when you used it in the field?
Well, I have to say, right away when I picked the camera up, I felt right at home. You know, I like the design of the body overall. It's got a nice feel in the hand, and the buttons are right where you want them to be. So that was quite nice. And I definitely think that the autofocus is not going to disappoint. Yeah. I felt like right away it would grab the subject, and once it grabbed the subject, it would hold on to it. Right out of the box, you just assign a button to be animal detect, eye detect, focus, and it's just going to work for you. There's a few settings you could change and perhaps improve things, but right out of the box, it's going to work fantastic.
It's definitely the ease of setup with the Canon autofocus that I enjoy a lot as well. As you say, you assign one button, you press it, and it finds the subject very well. And especially with the R6 Mark II, I felt like it just knows what the subject is. It knows what the bird is. It knows what the kangaroo is. It jumps onto it, and then it sticks to it as well. I hardly ever had the camera jump onto the background, for instance. What I also enjoyed was definitely the great image stabilization, but obviously there's not only great things about the camera. Were there some things that you didn't quite like?
I don't love having the video photo switch over on this side of the camera. I mean, I certainly can't have any way of reaching that. Yeah. So that means if I'm with my lens, I'm going to have to take my hand off and switch it. Maybe it's something you'd get used to. There's perhaps some benefits. I'm not saying it's a deal breaker by any means. The red record button isn't associated with the C3 functionality. It's kind of more back to how video was with the DSLRs, where it's basically whatever setting you're in, it just starts recording and you don't have a lot of control over your settings. Yeah. It's not as easy to be like shooting video clips on the fly. Would you agree?
Definitely. This is where the R5 and the R3 is really good, because if you press the red record button on top, it will automatically record with whatever settings you saved as custom function number 3. Whereas the R6 Mark II and all the lower end bodies, they just record in some, I don't know, strange auto mode with your current settings, but then once you're recording, you can't even really change the settings. So it's just not as good, but that's just for video. I think for photo, we both basically didn't really have any complaints. It tracked very well. It gave us great 40 frames per second, but obviously there's an elephant in the room, and that's the 24 megapixels. Did you feel like that's enough for wildlife photography?
Oh, well, we all, if you watch the show, you know, especially with the R3, I've said many, many times that I just don't think it's enough megapixels. The R7, you're getting 32 megapixels on the subject, right? And this camera in crop mode, you're getting 9 megapixels on the subject. So there's a huge difference in the number of pixels on the subject. Now, if that's important to you or not, only you can be the judge. What do you think, Jan? Do you think that 24 is enough?
I definitely think 24 megapixels is enough, and it's enough for most applications. But at the same time, you have to be a bit more conscious about it in the field, because you just have to try and be closer to the subject, shoot more full frame. I think with an R5 on R7, we've almost become a little bit lazy, because we can step a bit further back, make sure that we never clip a wing, for instance, and then crop in a little bit afterwards and still end up with a very large file width. On the R6 Mark II, if you crop a lot, like if you crop down to the crop size of the R7, you obviously end up with a pretty small file that might not be usable in all applications. So camera like the R7 definitely has a huge advantage there.
So for example, when I was shooting the Rufus hummingbirds the other day, now this is where it comes in. I have a 600mm lens and I have a 2x converter. So normally I wouldn't use my 2x converter that much, but in this case I slapped on the 2x converter, so I had 1200mm, and then I felt like 24 megapixels was enough. You know, I could still get a decent sized file. But if you were shooting, let's say for example, your biggest lens was a 100 to 500, all of a sudden maybe it's not quite enough. Especially the Rufus hummingbird is probably the smallest bird in North America. So, you know, you do need some megapixels and some focal length.
So now that we've brought the R7 into the mix, I know that you weren't the biggest fan of it. I still have mine and I use it sometimes, but what were the main reasons for you to not keep it around?
It was the opposite reaction of this one. Whereas this one I was like, oh, it feels nice, it's familiar. And the R7, I felt like it's a totally different body design. There were some real challenges with, like, you know, assigning dual back button focus and no back wheel. And that's not all. Feels like on paper it has all these specs, like this amazing autofocus, 30 frames a second and all these things. I felt like in electronic shutter mode, 30 frames a second wasn't even really shootable. I was getting so much rolling shutter, even on flying birds, just even a sequence of images, there'd be huge wobble in the frames. I felt like Canon should have made it better and charged a little bit more.
It was definitely a curious decision by Canon to kind of make the body smaller and change all that sort of familiar layout that we were used to from other Canon cameras. But at the same time, I must say there's a few things on the camera that actually work quite well. In the beginning, I didn't like the on-off video switch, but I must say compared to the R6 Mark II, I think this is a better solution because I can use only my thumb to go from photo to video, whereas with the R6 Mark II, I have to use my other hand. And then also, strangely enough, I wasn't a big fan of that wheel around the joystick in the beginning. But now whenever I use the R7 and then I go back to like an R5 or an R3, my thumb kind of wants that wheel at the top of the camera because it's kind of the natural position, and then otherwise I always have to kind of reach down. It's a nice camera, it's a great camera, but as a second body to an R5, for instance, it's a little bit more difficult to use because your fingers have to learn a completely new layout on the back of the camera.
The handling on the R7 definitely threw me off and ultimately was kind of why I sent it back and decided not to keep it. But overall, it's still a very good camera, and especially if you're just getting into wildlife photography, it is such an amazing tool compared to what I started with. My first digital camera was the Canon 10D, and if you compare something like an R7 to a 10D, I mean, it is light years ahead of that. So we have to keep in mind sort of what we're comparing things to. So it's a fantastic tool.
It has a small buffer. It has a lot of the wobbles in the electronic shutter mode. That's why I'm mainly shooting the first curtain electronic shutter now, where I don't have as many of the wobbles. And because the frame rate is a little bit slower, it also gives me a much larger buffer to work with. So that's not really an issue anymore. I just love the reach. Like, it is what it is. You love the 1.6 crop factor on your 7D2 cameras. It's just nice. Like, recently I was walking around on a pretty busy sort of lake, and there's all these ibises breeding in the middle of the lake. And to get the shots with the R5 on the 100 to 500, it was just too small. I would have had to use the extenders, and the best shot to shoot from was from a bridge, and there was lots of people walking past, so I didn't really want to get out a big 600mm lens on a tripod, block the whole bridge, and also be ambushed by 1,000 people per minute asking what I'm doing. So this is where the R7 really shined for me. I used the R7 100 to 500mm lens. I got effective 800mm of focal length in this tiny package. I could zoom right into the nest and get some nice images. So it's definitely nice in these situations when you want to reach, but it's always a bit frustrating because it's just not as consistent as some of the other cameras.
We're kind of nitpicking here. Just to be clear, the R7 is a very nice camera, especially if you're just getting into wildlife photography, for the reasons just like you said. There's some affordable lenses that you can pair with that camera and have a very, very capable wildlife photography kit. So it's definitely got some stuff going for it.
Yes, take the f11 800mm lens for instance. I actually used the R7 with that lens not long ago. I'll make a video about that soon. And you get 1280mm in a package that weighs under 2 kilos and costs about $2,500 US, which is less than the R6 Mark II. It's totally crazy to have that kind of very easy hand-holdable light walk-around kit at a great price point. And obviously we're complaining here at a very high level because we're comparing the R7 mainly to more expensive cameras like the R6 Mark II, R5, R3. And compared to those cameras, it's just a little bit inconsistent. But let's compare it to like a DSLR camera, for instance, Glenn. It's just So much better than basically any DSLR camera with the eye tracking, the frames per second, all these things that kind of lack maybe compared to the higher end models. It definitely beats basically all DSLR cameras.
Now, Jan, it's not all about the equipment that you have, is it? You could have the best camera or a mediocre camera or an entry-level camera. But if you don't learn how to process your photos properly, if you don't invest some time in digital darkroom and learning about how to edit your images, you're never going to get great results. So that's why we both offer some fantastic resources for you. Jan's got his masterclass video. I've got some ebooks you can check out. And of course, our pro sets will definitely save you time in the digital darkroom.
Because with just one click, you can transform your RAW files. Gun to your head, Glenn, you can only have an R6 Mark II or an R7, and you also only own a 100 to 400mm lens. What's your pick? No big lenses in this game.
I will say overall, the R6 II is definitely my preferred camera. It's more refined, and I just think it's an overall better camera. However, when you put that lens limitation on, I would pick the R7 because I just really think you need that reach. We would probably pick the R7 until you can kind of maybe afford an R5 for bird photography, because I think both the R3 and the R6, if it's your primary camera and you're shooting birds, it's probably not the ideal option just because of the limitations of the megapixels.
There's obviously another contender coming out very soon, the Canon R8. We will both get one and try it out and share our experiences with you. And it has the same sensor and apparently the same autofocus as the R6 Mark II. So I think we can expect some really good performance, some good high ISO performance. At the same time though, the camera has a different layout again. So we're both not gonna love that. There's no joystick at the back, there's no wheel at the back. And also all the buttons at the back of the camera are very far to the right hand side of the camera and quite small. So I know with us loving double back button autofocus, this might be an issue as well. So we'll have to see, but obviously the price point will be very attractive. It will have the same price as the R7 at $14.99. So I think from that perspective, it's a very attractive camera, but having a different layout again will definitely make it a challenge to use, especially if you had like an R7, an R8, and an R6 Mark II or an R5. This is three different sort of use concepts on the back of the camera.
What Canon should have done was made the R7 the R9, because then they kind of have like R8, R9, and R10 that are kind of more, they're like budget friendly kind of intro cameras. And then by the time you get into this different body style of the R6, the R7, what it should have been, and the R5, you have the same sort of body style in those three. So you have like these combos, a budget-friendly trio of cameras, and then a more mid-prosumer range ones. And then, of course, you get into the R3 and the future R1 that would be the pro bodies. That's how I would have done it if I was the president of Canon. That's what I would have done.
And now it's time for your favorite segment, the photo of the week. All of you who tag the images on Instagram with the hashtag BirdPhotoShow will now have a chance to have your image featured and looked at by Glenn and I and picked apart.
Have your image critiqued by us.
So this week we went through a whole bunch of images. There's almost 20,000 images tagged on there now, so it's becoming a big task to find a few. And there's always a few that stand out to us. So what's the one that stood out to you the most this week?
It's from Vins pasqua. I think this is a really cool species. I don't know if I've actually even seen an image of this species before. And there's some things I really like about it. I think it's a great pose, this little kingfisher. I assume it's quite a small species, posed on this sort of dead blade of grass. It looks like a dead reed. And obviously he's got like a praying mantis or something, so he's got that prey item. So those are the things that I think are really awesome. Jan, what do you think that I maybe would change about this image?
First of all, I think it's an epic image. It's a great looking bird. Definitely one I would love to photograph with the prey. It's awesome. I don't mind the perch. The main thing that stood out to me right away, all the grass, so I'd probably slightly work on the background. I don't mind sort of the grass blades in the background, but I would definitely try to kind of lessen the upper left-hand corner and also remove that out of focus blade going horizontally and just kind of make all the rest go vertically. I think that would just give it a slightly better flow. Is that what you were thinking, or am I way off here?
Exactly, yeah. I think just smoothing out the background so that you don't have those really stark kind of lines would really help. And then the other thing is, I'm not sure that this image needs to be presented in this 4:5 aspect ratio for Instagram. I would probably have cropped this to a square, made it a nice square crop and cleaned up the background. And I think we'd take this image even up to the next level. But overall, an awesome shot.
If this was for us on a wall or in a book, we might even crop it wider. But for Instagram especially, I think having it quite tight will give you the most engagement. The first image I brought is this awesome Aracari in flight by Raj and was taken in Costa Rica. I just loved the pose. I thought it was an awesome flight pose with all the wings fanned, the tail fanned, and you have a decent head turn as well. There's just a couple things I maybe would have changed on it, but what are your thoughts on it, Glenn?
Yeah, I agree with you totally. And for me, yeah, it just has a bit of a dark overall feel. I feel like when I think about Costa Rica and the tropics and everything, sometimes for certain birds that you're in the understory or stuff, you want maybe a little bit of that darker, moodier feel. But I think maybe here, especially brightening up the background might help this image overall. So I think that's probably, if it was my image, I'd probably boost the background up a little bit.
That's what I would have been doing as well. And that's kind of my specialty anyway, selecting the background, brightening it a little bit, because I think it will make the bird stand out a lot more.
And this is, again, one of those ones where, learning about post-processing. I'm not saying that's the case for this photographer. Maybe this is exactly how they want to present it, and that's fine. However, sometimes people want to make the overall image brighter, but then they realize that, for example, the yellow on the neck there and also the bill would start to get blown out, and they're not really sure how to deal with that, so they stop. Whereas if you learn how to do layer masking properly, you can very easily boost the overall brightness of the image and then recover those brightest bits. So just a little bit of sort of digital darkroom technique can sometimes give you more freedom to do what you want with the images. All right, so my next selection is from SS Wildlife, and it's very similar bird to the one I was photographing, the rufous hummingbird. This is an Allen's hummingbird. This is just a really nice portrait of the bird. And Jan, this perch should look familiar to you.
I was just going to say it looks a bit like an Aussie plan. And it's one of my favorite perches as well because it's really, really sturdy and has all these nice little leaves and these cool looking like seed pods on it. So it's a very nice perch and it's an image I like a lot overall. When I look at it on this screen here, it just seems like it has a bit of a warm cast overall maybe. So I would definitely try to bring out the colors in the throat a little bit more, maybe shift them away a little bit from the same color of the bird, and also make the back of the bird a little bit greener overall, and maybe just pull that white balance down ever so slightly to just separate the colors a little bit more, because I feel like the first look I see, it's a little bit kind of the same sort of yellow overall.
Yeah. All right, Jan, so what's your next image?
The next image I picked is from Essex Wildlife, and it's of this sedge warbler with a mouthful of, I think it's dragonfly larvae or some other sort of insect. And I just thought it was a really cool shot because if you don't know this bird, it's tiny, it's like a sparrow. So being able to be this close, have this kind of quality of image, I thought was a real standout. I'm sure it's a bit of a crop, but the image quality definitely seems to hold up, and I thought it was just really cool to have that tiny bird with a big mouthful, and there's probably not much I would change.
This is a perfect example of maybe where, just like we've been talking about, why you need those megapixels, because obviously if you're with only 24 megapixels and the bird's very small and you're far away, you're not going to be able to crop in to get something like this. But if you have maybe 45 or 50 megapixels, then you can still come away with these tight portraits. So yeah, I think it's a great shot. So good job, Essex Wildlife. My last image for this week is by O. Quintero Photography, and it's of this beautiful crimson-crested woodpecker. And one of the things I liked about this shot is it's a kind of an unconventional perch and an unconventional pose for one of these big, neotropical woodpeckers. The perch is still pretty cool, but it's perched really kind of funnily on it, and yet it shows off the bird really nicely because you see that full kind of barred chest. I think it looks really cool.
I think it's a really cool shot. That bird's obviously epic. We don't have any woodpeckers in Australia, which is a bit of a shame because they're pretty awesome birds. And the angle is definitely interesting on this photo because I can't even figure out whether this is shot high up in the tree, you're kind of looking at the bird's belly, or if it's more eye level and the bird's kind of hanging behind the perch. So it's definitely some intrigue there trying to figure out what I'm even looking at in terms of the angle, but all around a very nice image.
I really like the needles. I have no problem with those. I think they add nice texture to the background and they're kind of off to the side and they work in the composition. But I'm not crazy about that brighter kind of diagonal bit that's intersecting in with the needles. So just some soft kind of cloning would probably clean that up. And maybe I would also clean up the one that's sort of off to my left of the bird and it's a little bit bright behind him. But again, I think just a little bit of work on the background could even elevate this to the next level. Okay.
My last image is of this awesome looking blue grosbeak on a awesome perch with a great background and very nice light by Trey Barron. And I basically liked everything about this image. I just thought, again, it might have a slightly warm overall tone. So I would have probably used selective color, go to the blue channel and make the blues pop a little bit more on the bird. I would have then went in and selected the flower and maybe made that a little bit more green or shifted that a little bit away from the background. And I think then we would have had an image that's a true standout.
Yeah, I think technically this image is fantastic. A great perch, really nice background, the pose, everything. The only thing that I'm left wanting a little bit is I'm pretty sure this is not a full adult. Yeah. I think this is either a molting bird or a juvenile bird. And, you know, ideally, I would love, in a perfect world, I would love to see this exact shot, but with a perfect adult male up there.
I'm sure Trey would have thought the same thing.
Yeah, for sure.
So I hope you guys enjoyed this week's episode of the Bird Photography Show and that we will see you in one of our other videos very soon.
And a special thanks to Camera Canada for sending me this R6 Mark II. They're my go-to camera store, and they should be your go-to camera store if you're in North America as well.
And if you mention that you come from the Bird Photography Show, they will definitely look after you with a good deal.
Thanks so much for watching, everyone. We'll see you next time.
See you soon.